Hey guys, welcome back. I am Katie, where we break down complex financial and geopolitical stories into insights you can actually understand. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because what I'm about to show you is going to shake everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. At 0600 local time over Tamov All Blast, 43 Ukrainian drones were already in the air, racing low and fast toward the Progress missile factory, one of the most heavily protected pieces of airspace in Western Russia. The sky looked quiet from the ground, but the radar rooms were about to erupt. What the Russian crews did not know was that something else had been waiting for weeks, hidden beneath railroad tracks that fed vital supply lines toward Crimea. The men on duty that morning believed they were prepared to win every engagement. And in a narrow tactical sense, they were right. They would hit their targets, they would destroy incoming drones, they would follow procedure and perform exactly as trained. And that confidence, that expectation of success, was precisely what Ukraine had built this operation around. The first radar contacts appeared at 0604. One small return, then another, then several more. Within seconds, 6 new signals spread across the northern approach, carefully spaced to light up every radar screen in the defensive corridor at the same time. These were UJ-22 drones, simple, propeller-driven machines with a range of about 800 kilometers. Their radar signature was tiny, no bigger than a large bird. Each one cost around $30,000, replaceable, almost disposable. But together, they were about to force Russia's advanced air defense systems into the most expensive morning of their week. At first, the green sweep of the Panzer radar looked clear. Then, faint blips began to appear along the northern arc. The battery commander was already speaking rapidly over the tactical net, assigning sectors and calling out bearings to nearby crews. Coordination became critical immediately. If 2 batteries fired at the same drone, they wasted missiles. Both assumed the other would shoot, the drone might slip through. Every new contact made the decision cycle harder. By 0604, there were already more drones on the scope than batteries available to assign them. Some of the first crews to actually see the threat were not watching radar screens at all. The Zu-23 gun teams positioned along the tree lines heard the drones before they saw them. A sharp, high-pitched buzzing sound carried across the frozen ground, like distant lawn equipment echoing over open fields. Then, shapes emerged above the treetops. The gray airframes were barely larger than a dining table, skimming the canopy at about 200 kilometers per hour, roughly 125 miles per hour. At that speed and altitude, each drone stayed visible to a gunner for maybe 5 seconds before passing overhead and becoming someone else's problem. The gunners relied on iron sights, instinct, and muscle memory, while the more advanced radar systems struggled to separate drone returns from ground clutter. The Panzer S-1 system was designed specifically to counter threats like this. Mounted on a mobile platform, it carried 48 TKB-1055 mini-missiles, each costing about $170,000. In simple terms, it was a very expensive answer to a very cheap problem. Its rotating search radar could scan the sky in quick sweeps, covering up to 30 kilometers in ideal conditions. When it detected a target, it handed it off to a more precise fire control radar that locked on and calculated an intercept. Under perfect circumstances, the time from first detection to missile launch could be as little as 14 seconds. But perfect circumstances rarely exist in combat. At that height, radar signals bounced off buildings, hills, and tree lines. The ground itself created noise. Instead of seeing a clear dot in open sky, operators saw flickers mixed with terrain reflections. The effective detection range dropped from around 30 kilometers to closer to 12. The fire control radar had to filter a small moving signature from a messy background. It was like trying to hear someone whisper in a crowded restaurant. At 0605, the first missile left its rail. It streaked across 3 kilometers and detonated, tearing apart a Ukrainian drone in midair. Seconds later, another missile launched, then another. One by one, the UJ-22s exploded into debris. Technically, the system was performing exactly as designed. But every time a $170,000 missile destroyed a $30,000 drone, the financial balance tilted further out of proportion. It was like crushing a go-kart with a luxury sports car. You might win the collision, but the repair bill belongs to you. At 0600, each Panzer had 48 missiles ready. By 0610, some batteries were down to 31. By 0615, certain launchers showed only 19 remaining. The drones continued arriving from multiple directions. They were staggered just enough so that each battery had to engage them sequentially. Each engagement cycle consumed precious seconds and another missile. A battery tracking 2 drones at once had to choose which one to prioritize. Fire at the closer target, and the second might slip through. Hold fire too long, and both could threaten the protected zone. One northern sector battery engaged 2 drones nearly simultaneously. It destroyed the nearer one, but watched the second glide closer to the factory perimeter before another system intervened. Meanwhile, an eastern battery counted only 8 missiles left, with 3 drones inbound. Across the defensive corridor, crews realized they were burning through their magazines faster than the drones were disappearing. They were doing their jobs perfectly, and still losing something more important. 200 kilometers to the east, a fuel train was scheduled to pass through Kuchovka 2 later that day. The air defense crews had no knowledge of that connection. They believed they were protecting a factory. In reality, they were also shielding something hidden beneath nearby railway tracks. And that hidden element depended on the defenses staying active. Reloading was not simple. A Panzer system could not just swap out ammunition like a soldier changing a rifle magazine. It required a specialized transport loader vehicle, a team of 4, and about 20 minutes of work. During that time, the system had to go completely offline, launch rails exposed, no protection. In the middle of an active drone swarm, going offline for 20 minutes was almost unthinkable. Even if a loader truck stood nearby, beginning the reload process would leave the vehicle defenseless with dozens of missiles strapped to its frame. In combat, that vulnerability could be fatal. As the drones kept coming, Russian crews likely wondered why Ukraine was sending machines that were clearly going to be shot down. The drones did not need to survive. They needed to be detected. Their radar signature was carefully tuned to sit inside the Panzer's ideal detection zone, visible enough to trigger automatic engagement, slow enough to guarantee a full intercept cycle. A stealthier drone might slip through unnoticed, but it would not force a missile launch. These drones were not trying to avoid attention, they were demanding it. As missile counts dropped, Zu-23 gun trucks moved forward to cover gaps. These were simpler systems, twin autocannons mounted on flatbeds, capable of firing around 800 rounds per minute. Against a low-flying drone moving at 200 kilometers per hour, a gunner had about 4 seconds to aim and fire. Hitting such a target was like trying to shoot a plastic bag blowing across a highway. One crew managed to destroy a drone head-on, shredding it in midair. Another poured continuous fire into a target, finally clipping a wing after 40 seconds. But heavy sustained fire came at a cost. The barrels heated quickly, glowing red. These guns were rated for around 600 rounds before the metal risked warping. In a prolonged burst, that threshold could be reached in seconds. After a couple of intense engagements, the weapon either needed cooling time or risked malfunction. Even successful interceptions slowly degraded the system. By 0620, about 12 UJ-22 drones had been destroyed. Russia had spent more than $2 million in missiles and ammunition. Ukraine had lost drones worth roughly $360,000. Each individual interception looked like a defensive success. Taken together, the exchange was draining resources at an unsustainable rate. Then, at 0625, new radar signatures appeared behind the fading wave of UJ-22s. The operators could see immediately that these were not lightweight drones. They were AN-196 Lyuty systems with a range approaching 1,000 kilometers and carrying warheads of around 75 kilograms. Powerful enough to cause serious structural damage to industrial facilities. Their profiles cut cleanly through the radar clutter. And here is where the operation shifted from costly distraction to calculated design. The cheap drones had done their job. They had forced missile launches. They had reduced magazine counts. They had pressured coordination networks and strained gun crews. Now, with air defense inventories lower and reaction times stretched, the heavier strike platforms were arriving. This was not a random escalation. The first wave had prepared the battlefield by draining the shield. The second wave was designed to test what remained. From the Russian perspective, the morning had begun with confidence. They had tracked, fired, and destroyed incoming threats. They had followed procedure and demonstrated technical superiority in each engagement. But warfare is not decided by individual kills alone. It is shaped by resources, timing, and the invisible connections between actions. By the time the larger drones crossed into defended airspace, the defenders were no longer at full strength. Crews running on adrenaline and compressed decision cycles. What looked like a straightforward defense had become something else entirely. The sky above the Progress missile factory was no longer just a battlefield of targets and intercepts. It was a carefully staged sequence designed to exhaust, distract, and open a narrow window of vulnerability. The Russian crews believed they were winning every single engagement that morning. In isolation, they were correct. Drone after drone fell from the sky. But the broader contest was unfolding on a different level, measured not in wreckage, but in readiness. As the faster, heavier signatures advanced, the defenders faced a new reality. Every missile remaining in the tubes now carried more weight. Every decision had sharper consequences. The cheap swarm had reshaped the balance without ever needing to break through. And as the new wave closed the distance, the full meaning of the operation became clear. And here's the detail that turns this from a bad morning into a masterpiece of operational planning. These weren't launched at the same time as the decoys. Ukraine actually sent the heavier Lyuty drones first, hours earlier, launching them from airfields deep inside Ukrainian territory. The decoy drones were launched later from areas much closer to the border. Because the decoys had a shorter distance to travel, they reached Russian airspace first, even though they were slower. The Lyuty, flying faster but covering hundreds of extra kilometers, arrived about 20 minutes later. By the time they showed up, they were moving through a corridor that had already been drained and stressed by the earlier wave. That level of timing over such long distances was not random. Someone had calculated how long each drone would take to fly, how many decoys were needed to exhaust missile inventories, and how to make everything line up so the defenses were weakest at the exact moment the real strike arrived. About 15 kilometers out, the first Lyuty drone appeared on radar, closing fast at around 190 knots. Then, at 12 kilometers, a second contact appeared, flying low and hugging the terrain from the southwest. At 10 kilometers, a third joined the screen. The Panzer crews saw them and quickly realized they were facing a different kind of decision. These were not cheap decoys anymore. These were larger drones carrying heavy warheads, but the missile counters were already low. One crew tracked a Lyuty for 6 seconds without firing. They only had 3 missiles left. Another drone followed behind it. A third approached from another direction. In that moment, they made a decision that training manuals rarely prepare soldiers for. They let the first drone go. They watched a 75-kilogram warhead continue toward the factory with nothing left in its path. They chose not to shoot because using their last missiles too early could leave them completely defenseless moments later. Across the defensive line, similar choices were being made at nearly the same moment. Every battery had to decide whether to shoot and risk going empty, or hold fire and watch a threat pass. Either way, something important would get through. Then, around 06:35, something strange happened. One Lyuty drone flying toward the factory suddenly began drifting off course. At first, it didn't look like battle damage. There had been no explosion, no visible hit. Its flight path simply began sliding sideways, a few degrees off. Another drone from a different direction showed the same behavior. A third stopped following its programmed route entirely. There were no gunshots, no missile trails, no sound at all. Radar operators simply watched contacts wander off and disappear. Something unseen was affecting them. Whatever it was did not fire ammunition. It produced no radar signature, and it had likely been active long before the first decoy drone ever crossed the border. The system responsible didn't look dramatic. It was just a truck parked near the factory before dawn, carrying a trailer full of antennas. No missiles, no visible weapons, nothing that looked threatening at a glance. Yet this single vehicle would end up disrupting more of the strike than many of the missile batteries combined. This system was a broadband jammer designed to overwhelm satellite navigation signals. To understand how it worked, you have to think about how GPS normally functions. A satellite orbiting about 20,000 kilometers above Earth sends a signal that reaches a drone with extremely low power, roughly like seeing a car headlight from across the planet. That faint signal carries precise timing data, and the drone uses it to calculate its position. The math only works if the timing stays accurate down to incredibly tiny fractions of a second. The jammer didn't try to decode or manipulate the signal in a clever way. Instead, it simply flooded the entire area with powerful radio noise. It blasted static across a wide range of frequencies, creating a bubble roughly 30 kilometers across. Inside that zone, GPS and other navigation systems became unreliable. But the most dangerous part wasn't just signal loss. The jammer didn't only block signals, it created confusion. The drones inside the bubble didn't simply go blind. They received distorted data that made them think they were somewhere they were not. And it wasn't just military equipment affected. Civilians living nearby had already noticed strange problems for months. Mobile service would drop unexpectedly. They had no idea that the same invisible interference confusing drones was also interfering with everyday electronics in the area. As each surviving drone entered the jamming zone, its navigation began to fail in subtle ways. Inside the drone, the GPS receiver started receiving corrupted timing signals. At first, the errors were tiny. The drone's estimated position might jump dozens of meters in one direction, then suddenly shift again. The autopilot tried to correct the errors, steering toward phantom coordinates that didn't exist in reality. Each correction pushed it further from the intended path. The drones themselves had no idea anything was wrong. Their onboard systems still reported normal operation. That's what made jamming so dangerous. A missile destroys a drone instantly and visibly. Jamming works quietly. It convinces the machine everything is fine while guiding it toward failure. One of the expensive Lyuty drones drifted more than 10 degrees off course, followed a false coordinate, and crashed into trees kilometers away from any meaningful target. A highly capable strike drone worth millions was effectively neutralized by a truck burning fuel. Inside the jamming vehicle, operators monitored the results. For nearly an hour, everything worked perfectly. Every drone that entered the bubble showed signs of confusion. One after another, they drifted, turned away, or crashed. The system was performing exactly as intended. But then, something changed. Around 0645, new drones entered the jamming zone and behaved differently. Instead of drifting, they held their course. No deviation, no hesitation. The jammer continued broadcasting at full power, but these drones ignored it completely. On the operator's screens, signals showed the jammer working normally. Yet the incoming drones were unaffected. These drones weren't relying on the signals the jammer was trying to block. They were navigating in another way entirely. On board these drones was a different type of flight computer. Unlike traditional systems that rely heavily on GPS, this one used cameras and onboard sensors to navigate independently. Most drones operate like someone using a navigation app. They follow coordinates step by step. Remove the signal and they get lost. But this system worked differently. It looked down at the terrain and compared what it saw to stored satellite imagery. Roads, rivers, fields, and forests acted as landmarks. The drone matched real-time camera footage with preloaded maps, constantly checking where it was based on visual patterns. Before launch, its memory had been filled with a detailed strip of satellite images covering the entire route. A downward-facing camera compared the ground below with those stored images. If the shapes matched, the drone knew where it was. Even without satellites, it could keep navigating. Additional onboard sensors like gyroscopes and accelerometers tracked motion and orientation, helping maintain accuracy between visual checks. This made the system extremely hard to stop using traditional electronic warfare. You can jam a radio signal, but you cannot jam a camera looking at the ground. You can flood frequencies with noise, but you cannot confuse a gyroscope measuring movement. These drones effectively ignored the jamming field. They flew through it as if nothing was there. For years, electronic defense strategies had assumed that most drones depended heavily on satellite navigation, but these systems proved that assumption wasn't always true. The new drones didn't need satellites to find their way. They could still navigate using vision and internal sensors. As they continued forward, radar operators noticed something else. Their flight paths weren't converging on the factory anymore. Instead, their trajectories pointed several kilometers west. That meant the real target might not be the facility everyone had been trying to defend. Something else lay along that path. At about 8 kilometers out, the nearest Panzer battery had already run dry. Gun trucks were too far away to intervene in time. The incoming drones were now just minutes from wherever they were heading. The tension inside control rooms grew as operators watched the steady approach. The operators inside the jammer vehicle had watched dozens of earlier drones fail inside their electronic bubble, but these new ones passed straight through without hesitation. It was like watching someone walk calmly through a storm that had knocked everyone else off their feet. The jamming system had been broadcasting constantly for nearly an hour. In doing so, it had also revealed its own location. Powerful electronic emissions are easy to detect. Anyone monitoring the spectrum could pinpoint where they were coming from. By transmitting continuously, the jammer had effectively drawn a bright circle around itself. And that meant something important. The coordinates of that powerful signal had likely been identified long before the first drone even took off. The attacking side didn't need to guess where the jammer was. They already knew. The drones that ignored the jamming weren't flying blindly. They were flying directly toward a known position. As the distance closed further, the realization became unavoidable. The drones that could not be jammed were not aiming at the factory, somewhere that had been broadcasting its presence across the electromagnetic spectrum for nearly an hour. And the final detail was simple but chilling. The location had been known in advance. Ukraine had the coordinates loaded before the drones ever launched. The operatives who'd buried that phone had done their part weeks ago. They had hidden a small device beneath a stretch of railroad track and walked away, knowing everything else would happen later. Now, weeks after that quiet moment, the entire operation had come down to one final obstacle. The only thing still standing between that hidden device and a completed chain of events was a single truck parked nearby, covered in antennas and broadcasting invisible signals across the air. At about 2 kilometers away, the Skynode drone's cameras finally picked up the target. The truck appeared clearly in the frame, and the onboard system immediately recognized it. The shape matched perfectly with the images stored in memory before takeoff. The drone had been navigating by comparing terrain and landmarks, but now it switched modes. Instead of scanning hills and roads, it began looking for a very specific object. The flight computer locked onto the truck and the antenna arrays. Every angle matched the reference images. This was the exact target it had been sent to find. The irony was almost unbelievable. One of the most powerful defensive electronic warfare systems in the entire corridor had a range of 30 kilometers, but at that moment, it had no way to defend itself. It could block signals, confuse navigation, and blind electronics, but it had no guns or missiles to shoot down what was coming. And what was coming carried a 75-kilogram warhead. 4 seconds before impact, there was nothing left to do. At 06:58, the strike landed. The explosion ripped through the truck and the trailer behind it. Metal twisted, antenna arrays folded inward, and the entire jamming system was destroyed in an instant. But the most important effect wasn't the fire or the wreckage. It was the silence that followed. For months, that truck had filled the air with noise. Now, suddenly, that noise vanished. 30 kilometers of broadband jamming disappeared at once. Not slowly, not gradually. It was like flipping a switch off. Across the region, signals returned immediately. GPS receivers snapped back to accuracy. Navigation systems corrected themselves. Electronic maps stabilized. Where confusion had existed seconds earlier, even the invisible lines guiding navigation across the corridor straightened out. For the first time in months, the airspace and the surrounding land were no longer wrapped inside a blanket of interference. The factory suddenly stood exposed. The air defenses had already spent most of their missiles earlier in the morning. The jamming protection was now gone too. If another wave of drones had followed, confusion began to replace tension. The surviving drones had flown past the factory instead of attacking it. After half an hour of waiting with no follow-up strike, some crews began to relax. They assumed they had survived the worst. Some even felt relieved, believing they had managed to stop a major attack. But that sense of victory was built on a misunderstanding. The real objective had never been the factory itself. Somewhere beneath a stretch of railroad track, a buried phone was finally able to reconnect to the outside world. For months, it had been silent, unable to reach a network. Now, for the first time, it could detect a signal again, and that small change meant everything. Later that afternoon, at around 15:30, a fuel train rolled into the classification yard about 5 kilometers west of the factory, where a major rail line narrowed into a single choke. Everything moving toward Crimea and the southern front had to pass through this location. The yard stopped working. Entire supply chains could freeze. The train that arrived that afternoon carried 16 tank cars. 11 were filled with gasoline, and 5 carried compressed gas. Beneath the rails, hidden in the ballast and invisible from above, the device planted weeks earlier remained in place. It was simple but deadly. A mobile phone wired to a detonator, waiting for just one thing: a signal. It didn't need a long call. It didn't need a conversation. It didn't even need someone to answer. All it needed was a moment of connection. 1 bar of service was enough. For months, that connection had never come. People living nearby had noticed weak mobile service and blamed their providers. Calls dropped. Messages failed to send. It seemed like an everyday technical problem, but it was never a network issue. The powerful jamming system had been drowning out everything. Its wall of radio noise covered a huge range of frequencies, blocking navigation systems and cellular bands alike. GPS signals disappeared, but so did everyday mobile connections. LTE and other communication bands simply could not function inside that electronic bubble. That included the hidden phone under the tracks. When the jammer was destroyed at 0658 that morning, the bubble collapsed instantly. The rail beneath one of the cars suddenly cracked apart. The train began to derail in a chain reaction. One car pulled the next off the tracks. Couplings snapped. Metal screamed against metal as the entire train twisted and folded. Tank cars slammed into each other. Steel ruptured. Fuel spilled into the open air. Within moments, gasoline ignited. A massive fireball rose high above the yard, climbing hundreds of meters into the sky. Thick smoke spread across the countryside. The heat was so intense that emergency crews struggled to approach the scene. Containment became nearly impossible in the early moments. That single explosion shut down the narrow rail choke point feeding supplies toward the southern front. With that line blocked, fuel deliveries stopped. The effect rippled outward, disrupting supply chains far beyond the blast site. A single hidden device had achieved what waves of visible attacks might not have managed. The entire operation had lasted less than an hour in the morning and only a few seconds in the afternoon. Dozens of drones, millions of dollars in equipment, and complex planning across hundreds of kilometers had all been used for one purpose: not to destroy a factory, not to win a visible battle, but to restore a single bar of cellular signal to a phone buried beneath a rail line. If you like this video, then we think you'll love this one of Ukraine blowing up a dam. Bye for now.